how close are the wolves? Super close. I don't want to lamp this.
You broke out of the west. We're trying to force his rhythm on the
I mean, sure.
I don't know.
I love Overwatch. This is just my favorite. This is great sequence right there. Dude. Right. I mean, that's just awesome. That's awesome.
Come on.
Oh, hit me. No. No way. Bring it. This bring has to die. What?
Oh,
goodness,
this is the Overwatch I live for, baby! Woo! More Aritza Microbucks, I need them! I haven't played tag in weeks, and this is the exact invigorating boost I needed to want to play again! Woo!
Man, so dumb. Like, everything counters tanks. Everything. I have to fucking keep a checklist like a fucking account. Like, yeah, they use fucking cha-ching. They use fucking Suzu. Cha-ching. Yeah, they use TP. Cha-ching. They use fucking sleep. Cha-ching. They use nade. Cha-ching. They use nade on Cassidy. Cha-ching. They use Wraith. Cha-ching. They use shout. Cha-ching. 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 What the fuck? What the fuck do I do? It's so boring. It's so boring. I'm going crazy playing this shit game.
Okay, I know I talk about tank a lot, but I'm gonna do it again. And this focuses on tank, but it's an overall video on like Overwatch and game design and how the current risk to reward ratio on characters and roles doesn't line up right. Like currently, in any sort of FPS game or in Overwatch specifically, you need to have a certain amount of risk and a certain amount of reward. And realistically, you want there to be sort of a diagonal line here. If this is the low area and these are the high areas, you want to make sure that you stay balanced on that line, because this line right here is when two players, it feels fair. Because then you're like, okay, you're not getting as much value. But the problem is that this can be used both for the abilities and the roles in general. Now, if we look at the tank role, I would say that the tank role generally sits in this area. You have extremely high risk and extremely low rewards. That's what makes tanks so frustrating. And then you have DPS, which have high risk, high reward, which sits in this area. This is the reason why, like for DPS, it feels good now, because of the fact that they get to negate all of the healing, which is the frustrating aspect to Overwatch 2, and all of the AoE and burst healing and whatnot. They actually have kill potential. So it feels like it's somewhat, at least more somewhat in the hands of those players, they have more control. And then you have supports, which I'm sorry, but you sit down here. It's not to say that each hero falls into each one of these categories. There are certainly some that separate them from each other. But generally speaking, after having played all three roles, this is what it feels like to player perception, and the reason why it's so frustrating. Because the reason why it's like that is because of the fact that tanks, they're the focus, right? So they sit in front of everybody and they are constantly getting shot. So they take a ton of damage and they eat up all the CC, they eat up everything. And because they have so much health, it just makes them more valuable. And it's because the game isn't about outplaying, it's just about who's stronger and who just shoots more. It's extremely frustrating because then also at the same time, you don't have the DPS passive, so everything's inconsistent. And all of your ultimates are countered by basic support abilities. So you cannot take action until you see the people in this area actually do something. You are just left sort of constantly shooting back and forth, waiting, trying to make an opening. But realistically, you're either waiting for your DPS to get a pick or you're waiting for the enemy supports to use their abilities. DPS sits here because of the fact that you do have to take risks in terms of taking off angles. You have a lower health pool. There's a greater margin for error, and there's a greater margin for error for you to mess up, right? But there's also a greater opportunity for you to get picks. If you're playing Widow or Cassidy or Tracer or Genji, like there's a lot of high risk in playing these characters, but there's also great reward when it does work out. And then you have supports like Kiriko or Lifeweaver, where everything is really easy to do, but the rewards are extremely great on them. And like lack of margin for error on supports while also sitting in the safest position. Because you have to remember, tanks are here, DPS are in this area, and then supports are like back here, right? At no point, in order to just for the enemy team to get to supports, you still have to somehow pass by 3 other people, right? So that's the reason why, like, not only are the abilities for supports really strong, but their positioning is super low risk, and it doesn't feel balanced because it doesn't feel fair. Because for tanks, in order to get value, it feels like you need to play at the utmost perfection to get value, to get any value at all. Whereas a support sitting all the way in the back line could just press E at the ground when an enemy tank tries to make a play and just negate it entirely. So you have this extremely high reward, but extremely low risk. And that's the reason why supports are so frustrating to deal with on the tank side. And it's not to say that it isn't like fun for supports. That's the problem, is that for supports, from their perspective, it's fun. The game is fun and it's fine. And whenever they're just telling like, hey, tank players, just like shut up, it's like you play in different worlds. You're in entirely different universes. Like tanks have every right to complain because they can't just press an ultimate and get value, right? Like we saw a Junker Queen get her ult negated after the Suzu was used and after Brig used Shield Bash. Emong decided to ult, which actually was the right idea. And Mei did the right idea by having a very well-timed Mei wall. But the problem is that although it was a well-timed Mei wall, that Junker Queen already knew she could not act, or Emong knew she could not act until she saw the Suzu come out, which means you're just sitting there waiting because you can't be proactive about what you want to do. Despite the fact that everyone's grouped together and everyone's just playing Rock'em Sock'em Robots, you can't do anything, so you're waiting. And then you get your ultimate blocked, you get frozen, and then you get booped off of the edge. And there's like the question I have to ask people in that moment is, what could he have done differently? Right? That is the most important question that you really need to ask yourself. Like whenever you see someone die, whenever you see someone make a play, like what could they have done differently? Right? Because if it's just like, oh, wait until Brig Bash is down, plus Suzu's gone, plus Mei Wall is gone, like all while you're being shot at the entire time, like that's incredibly frustrating. Whereas like what do the supports have to do? The amount of work and effort that's put in is just not the same. So let me show you by like using some examples where like, we saw Zarya use a grav, hit like 4 people and barrage, but the lamp went around the corner, right? And there's extremely low risk and high reward with an ability like that because of the fact that like he threw it behind a wall. And it's like, what are you gonna do? Like, oh, okay, like you see him grouped up, it's like, oh, like, well, the counterplay is literally just like wait until they're out in the open better. Like, I don't know, like negating that much damage, it feels crappy, especially when there's immortalities, because you're sitting there thinking to yourself like, oh, I want to try and make a play because they're all grouped up like this. But it's like, no, you need to sit and wait. As a tank player, you need to just wait. That's what your role is like you just sit there and wait. Your role is to take as much damage as possible, to get punched repeatedly, and to sit there and wait. But because you have to wait, the longer you wait, the longer there could be time that your team could die. So you want to be proactive sometimes in terms of making a play. But when you are countered by abilities that all sit in this range, it sucks. Like that's not fun. The amount of skill needed to do for a support to press E on someone versus the amount of skill needed to make sure that not only do you land your ultimate, but you land it in a good position, but also you grab as many people as possible, but also you do it while your team is there. Like the the risk and reward is like up in this area at best. And we're talking about supports who are down here who are dictating like how the game is played. And like then you have things too as well. Like even if, you know, it wasn't BAP, say it was Lifeweaver, right? Well, say you grab one person. Well, there's Lifeweaver on the team, so he just pulls him out. Low risk, high reward. Or or he still has pedal. He throws the pedal out. Low risk, high reward. Sigma ultimates, and then Lifeweaver, of course, just held his pedal, so that way he just like looks down, like low risk, high reward. Everything that frustrates tanks sits in this area. And that's the reason why it's not fun. And then you have clips like Super going after Brig, right? I don't know how many people have played Winston, but juggling people in Winston ult, incredibly difficult. And it's incredibly frustrating when you're juggling someone perfectly and every hit you do doesn't matter because the DPS didn't touch them once. So the amount of skill needed in order to do that is extremely high. There's so much margin for error for tanks to make due to their positioning and their timing of their abilities and how difficult they are to do. But the reward is so low, and it's so dependent on just the fact that your team does one thing to like a DPS can hit them with a DPS passive to interrupt that healing by just temporarily in order for you to get a kill. But the entire time you watch those clips of Super attacking Brig or juggling her or juggling the Ashe, and like you can't see who's got the DPS passive on them. So you think that you're playing correctly, and you are in terms of your skill expression. But because the healing is inconsistent, you're dying to things where you're like, oh, this is frustrating because like, why didn't she die? Like, I can't believe she didn't die. She should have died. She's died in other times. And it's like, that's true. But that's because you didn't see the invisible passive that hit her by the DPS heroes. But this is the reason why like Overwatch 2 just isn't fun. Like it's all over the place in terms of like its risk reward. And counterplay is based on that idea that you have a certain amount of risk or, margin for error that allows you to make a mistake. You have heroes like Ana and Zen, which used to be high risk, high reward, right? Non-mobile heroes that dished out a lot of damage and could do a lot, bring a lot of value, and had a lot of utility and a lot of other, uses behind them, but were extremely susceptible to flankers, right? And then you created someone like Kiriko, who had incredibly easy to perform abilities. And now here's the thing. I understand you're talking about people talk about win rates, but win rates don't tell you how it feels to play against and the reason why it's balanced. Like her win rate doesn't mean anything. Just in the same way that a stat board's, someone playing Bastion talking about how much damage they're doing, saying that they're doing the most on the team. Like it doesn't matter here. The win rates don't matter. The amount of risk that she needs to take versus the amount of reward that she can get is down here. How easy is it for her to heal versus how much value it gets? Probably around here. How difficult is Suzu? Not difficult. It's right around here. How difficult is Swift Step? It's not difficult. It's right around here. How low are her cooldowns? Pretty darn low for what they do. Everything about her sits down here, and she can climb walls, and she can do damage. So all of the things that made Ana and Zen great up here, well, why would you play either of those two when you could just play Kiriko, who does all of those things and more, right? And not only that, but Kiriko's ultimate is one of the best in the game, right? If you use Kiriko's ultimate, you immediately gain space and gain value. If you grab, there's no guarantee you get value. If you shatter, there's no guarantee that you get value. Like, and why is that? Well, because of all the supports who have low risk, high reward abilities that can just negate everything that you do. Like, it's already hard enough to find a position and maybe try and make a play, but everything you do is denied. Everything, your entire existence is denied by the fact that you don't have the DPS passive, you don't have the ease, how easy the abilities are to use, and your ultimates all require a lot of assistance and backup and follow up in order to get value. So you know, it's not to say that you can't occasionally make plays as tank, but what you do then and what the solution was is like, hey, we're going to buff the tanks and give them health, like a bunch of health. But now that continues the problem of just like, you're not improving counterplay with just more health on tanks. You're just making them more frustrating to play against, but also you're making, that's the reason why like the counter swap things are more frustrating, because of the fact that before, even with the tanks increasing in health just the first time from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2, it made counter swapping more of a problem, because now those windows of opportunity when a tank made a mistake and, you know, they countered you, you at least knew that you had a window in which you could attack them for making that said mistake. I want to use Zarya and Rein just as an example, because Rein counters Zarya pretty hard just in terms of existing, right? Before, if Rein wasted the resource of his shield or charged in at a wrong time, you could outplay him as Zarya by killing him for stepping out of place. But the problem is now they buffed his health so much that it's very easy for him to charge in, make a mistake, and then not be punished for it, that he's able to get his health back up. And in that time, your team is probably playing too aggressive and dies, and you can't make a play, so you're forced to switch, because people don't understand that if you're in a countered matchup, sometimes you need to play a little bit slower. Before, if you were playing Rein, you had a lower risk, higher reward. This is kind of like where you'd be, right? But then with the health increase and just like buff of craziness, it's like, oh, well, now I'm here and Zarya's sitting here. Like now, in order to get value, it's extremely difficult for you to get value as Zarya. But the Rein doesn't have to try as hard, because even if he makes a mistake, he's got so much health and damage reduction and the ability to heal more that he just sits there. So what do? You switch to someone else. You switch to Orisa, which what does that happen to? Then it switches it. Now Rein is up here and Orisa's down here. And you get more value because of the fact that just by switching in that counter swapping matchup, that's the reason why counter swapping is such a problem, and why the increase of health is not the solution. Making them tankier isn't the solution. Making them have the ability to outplay their problems is the solution. Making them have the ability to outplay their counters is the solution. Because like Spylo said what Spylo said in one of his videos when he was reviewing the tank patches is it doesn't help to buff what they already do better. You need to give them tools in which to counterplay their tough matchups. And until all of this is addressed, and everything kind of lines up at least close to this line, like not everything's going to be perfect, right? You're constantly going to have abilities that sort of do this, but that is a lot better than at all going in these areas, right? But Overwatch 2 can be saved and salvaged in this way. Like it can be fixed. But the problem is that there's so many abilities that are, especially on the support side, which just get so much value, but also don't allow you to make a cool play. Like, you know, Ana's sleep dart sits up here, which is the reason why, like, if you sleep a nano blade in Genji, you're like, oh, okay, like that works. But all the immortality abilities sit down here. Like some of these abilities are just broken by design in terms of how much value they give. They just can't give that much value if they're going to be that easy. It's the same with like the healing, like, you know, Lifeweaver's auto aim healing. The problem is that it's always going to be either broken or useless because of the fact that there's no margin for error. There's no risk involved in that, in using that. There's no risk involved in, you know, using life grip. The only thing that you do when you're playing against these abilities is you're like, I just need to get them to use them faster. And then it becomes frustrating because then nothing's dying. I just want to get a point across, hopefully one day, to the devs, one developer to another, is that, you know, you keep focusing on these statistics like, oh, we need to look at the player stats. We need to look at you know, the win rates of these characters. Like Orisa is not doing so well, so we need to bring her back out. We need to buff her up a little bit, give her tiny buffs because she's not performing great. But it's like, what is the counterplay to Orisa? Like, other than Zarya or Sim, what is the counterplay to Orisa? Because if you're playing Soldier, you're shooting a wall. If you're playing DPS, you're shooting a wall. If you're playing tank, you're shooting a wall. What does her Fortify ability do? Makes it so she doesn't take damage. What does her spinny do? Makes it so she doesn't tank damage. And then what is her like main like force? Like how does she make plays? She just doesn't tank damage. And like, let's say she uses all of her abilities. Like, what do you do to outplay her when she has so much more health and armor and everything else? Like, it's the same problem that you have with Hog. They can get a lot of value. Oh, and she's got no fall off range on her shots. And the only one that might be like skillful expression is like the javelin. But Hog can one shot you. But before, when you had, you know, the ability like to interrupt his healing or to interrupt his ult, like now it's just you're literally just shooting walls. Like that's why I don't understand how people can't, how, you know, even the developers can't see that the frustrating part is that for tank right now, it's not a skill expression. You're literally just shooting walls, because even if they mess up all of their abilities, it doesn't matter. You can't outplay them, because the mistakes that they need to make in order to die as a tank now are 2 to 3 times as much. You know, some tanks can cycle through their abilities more than twice and still end up killing you. And that's a frustrating experience to be in. So, you know, you need to balance this sort of risk to reward and not do that through base stats. So now you've created this huge new problem in which the risk and skill expression required in order to play tank still isn't matching up for the reward in terms of what it gives you. And even if you have giving them more health and lowered the amount of risk it takes to play them, it gets closer to that line, but you're still not hitting the reward that you need in order to feel like what you're doing matters. But with that increased amount of health, it makes it frustrating to play against, because of the fact that you have this large monster of a beast running at you, in which you can't outplay on your own as a single player, as a solo player, as a DPS or a support. And it feels like at times you can just get run over. So then you create an opposite problem where on the other side, for a DPS or a support, you're wondering, what could I have done differently when I just watched that tank miss all of their abilities and cycle through their entire cooldown twice, and I still couldn't outplay them. I still couldn't kill them, right? It feels like then the control is less in your hands and creates a problem where now nobody is happy. And it's incredibly frustrating to play against. And also understand that the game feel matters far more, and the perception of what players feel like. If they feel like they could have done better, they will keep playing your game. But right now, as in, you know, seeing Salt, and the reason why I had Salt end that last, you know, montage of clips was because of the fact that he's frustrated, because what is he supposed to do? In all these situations where you see tanks juggling players and they're just getting burst healed by auto aim packs from Brig or invisible healing or, you know, immortality lamps, what are the players supposed to do? And when they die in those moments and they ask themselves, what could I have done better? If the answer isn't obvious, it's a failure by design. So tank will never be fun as long as we don't address the player perception and say, fuck it to the win rates. Those stats that you keep looking at that you think you're balancing the game off of aren't working, and they aren't going to work. You need to understand how the game is played from multiple perspectives, and not just ask yourself what's fun for a player to do, but how do you counterplay it? Because things like Life Grip, Suzu, Lamp, or Juno's new auto aim homing ability, which is rage inducing to die to or to get hit by, like that's not skill expression. That's a player presses a button and gets instant value. You need to have a margin for error. And if there's no margin for error, I question if it needs to be in the game at all, or at the very least, it needs to have extremely low value. We have given so much value in terms of how much healing does without thinking creatively on like how to use it, that it's kind of spiraled out of control. And, you know, I have not played much at all this season, except for a few times maybe friends have asked, and like I don't care, because every time I hop back on, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember why I quit. Like, it just doesn't have the same kick anymore when you know that you could be playing something that has a lot of risk, that is a lot of fun, but because your heroes and the heroes that you loved and that you play the game for fall in this area, eventually at some point you're just going to get pushed out and you're like, I don't care anymore because everyone down here was just telling me, well, if you don't like it, just leave. And I'm like, all right, like, I guess I'm out. But, you know, eventually at some point people are going to get frustrated and just be done. I see the Overwatch streamers play, but they play because it's, at this point, like, it's their job. But every time I seem to tune in, they don't seem to be having much fun anymore. And like, I don't know. To me, the answer seems obvious, but I don't know. We'll see. I still hope and hope the game improves. I hope they do well. But, you know, once again, when the developers cite win rates, just remember it's the same as like that player in your game citing their damage on the scoreboard. Like, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt. You got to read it in context because context matters.